Chapter 23. Imogen woke as the sun was shining its first rays over the mountains to the east. She yawned as she sat up, her wild curls flopping into her face. Not having the energy to move yet, she tried to blow them out of her eyes, but they just fell stubbornly back in place. With a growl, she put her hair into a messy bun and slid out of her warm, inviting bed. Tomorrow, she'd be sleeping on a cot in Baileysgare, and she just knew while it would be a fun experience, it was certainly not going to be memory foam fabulous. She dressed slowly, mornings were not her best, and went to the kitchen to start the coffee. While her aunt was a morning person after years of farm life, she only drank tea and hadn't quite mastered the art of the cocoa bean yet. It was infinitely better for Imogen's taste buds to handle it herself. Otherwise, she never knew what she was going to get. Too strong, too weak, or just too gritty. Yuck, that was a tough day. While the coffee brewed and her vision cleared, Imogen looked out the windows to enjoy the view of the animals waiting by the gate for her to come out. Sometimes the goats would even find a way to escape and come up to the porch. She had no idea how they managed it, but it made her laugh every time. They never ran away, just seemed content enough to wait for her and escort her to the barn feed room as if she'd lose her way. Everything looked peaceful, and she quickly drank her first cup before placing it on the counter to reuse when she was done feeding. As expected, when she opened the door, her favorite goat, Arnie, was waiting with a little bleat and a hop of excitement. She reached down to scratch his beard, and throwing her vest on over the morning chill, began to walk with him down to the barn. Over the last few weeks, she'd gotten into a routine and had made sure everyone's feed buckets were labeled and ready the evening before, so that she could just separate those who were a little spicy with food and be as efficient as possible. When she got to the goat pen, Arnie in tow, she paused. Fortune looked up from his hay and nickered to her. She didn't know what was more surprising, that he was there, that he was in the goat pen, or that he seemed perfectly happy with Edmund on his back, bleating a greeting. Well, what are we going to do with you? Fortune, I wasn't exactly planning for another visit, so I don't have breakfast for you. Seemingly unconcerned, he walked over to Imogen and inspected the buckets just in case. She laughed and rubbed his lush forelock affectionately. Sorry, buddy, I can't give you anything or your mom will be mad. I'm pretty sure you're on a special diet anyway. She kept up a one-sided conversation as she continued her feeding, but opted to leave him in the goat pen. Everyone seemed happy enough, and it wasn't like she had a round pen or even a halter and lead rope to bring him somewhere else. It was funny that he kept showing up at her back door. While his barn wasn't far, she imagined he was stalled at night. It took a bit of skill to keep escaping and travel through the woods at night. This one was brave and smart. Imogen couldn't help but admire it. I see your friend's back again, her aunt called from her perch on the porch. Today, she'd braided her hair over her shoulder and had a big flannel over her bootcut jeans. She leaned against the railing for support, her crutches next to her, unused but available. Apparently he's made friends with your goats, Imogen responded with a wry grin. She watched as Edmund jumped off Fortune's back and hopped around the ground in delight, while the big thoroughbred dozed, one leg cocked. It's so funny how he keeps getting out. I don't even know how he got into the goat pen. There aren't any breaks in the fencing. Joe wasn't surprised. Laura had mentioned how athletic this horse was and that he was being trained as a show jumper. She suggested as much to her niece. I agree. I think he probably must have jumped the fence, Imogen mused. I don't know how he keeps doing it. It must be 5 feet tall. It is, actually. He must be a talented jumper. Either that or he had a lot of motivation, Joe thought. Imogen sighed in resignation and picked up the feed buckets to put back in the feed room for later. Wow, I don't think I've ever jumped more than 3 feet, even when I was competing heavily. I would love to see him in action sometime. Then she took out her phone. I'll text Laura and let her know that he's here. My guess is they've sent out another search party, or will soon anyway. She shot off a quick text and wasn't surprised to see Bubbles popping up almost immediately. Laura was aware and would be by to pick him up after she informed the owner of the incident. Imogen would not want to be in her shoes. Bianca was kind of scary when she was mad. Laura must be getting frustrated herself at all the chaos Fortune was causing. It couldn't be easy to handle such a strong-willed horse. Still, he seemed happy enough hanging out with the goats. For now, at least. Imogen continued her morning chores, filling the waters and mucking out the pens. The goats seemed to love the big bay horse and took turns jumping up and down off him. If he minded, he didn't do anything, just a flick of an ear periodically. Seeing how comfortable he was, she found it hard to imagine him at the World Equestrian Center jumping a 1.3-meter course. No, she reminded herself as she glanced at the fencing around the goat pen. She could imagine it, just not in a fancy show ring. Deciding that since everything was calm, or as calm as it would get, she would finish her packing for her 3 days away on the trail. If she forgot something, she was out of luck. Time to make a list and start pulling things out. Luckily, her aunt had some camping gear she could borrow. The rest, well, she'd have to get in town. Imogen finished the last touches of her list and looked impatiently at her phone for the 4th time. Laura should have arrived by now. All was quiet in the paddock, so she decided to go in and finish picking the paddocks while she waited. She stepped off the porch and turned around as Cookie gave a soft woof from her spot on the little dog bed her aunt had someone drop off the week prior. Her dog had immediately fallen in love with it and was often found there when she wasn't following Imogen or Joe around. Imogen turned to her pet and motioned for her to stay in place, then proceeded to enter the paddock gate. Fortune picked his head up from his hay and looked at her, a piece of stalk sitting in his mane like a bad hair extension. She couldn't help it. She laughed out loud and then harder still at the look on his face, knowing he couldn't really be offended. After all, horses didn't get their feelings hurt, did they? She walked up to him as he watched her warily and picked it out of his thick hair, holding it up to him and offering. He accepted greedily, and when she walked away to pick up her muck rake, he followed behind. "Don't be nosy, I'm just picking up the mess." He poked his nose curiously in the back of the ATV, where she was adding it so she could take it to the compost pile later. "It's not food, silly." Fortune shook his head and cleared his nose of the smell. "You sound like a dragon. Come on, if you're going to follow me, you might as well help." Fortune stayed with her for a few minutes as she worked, nudging her arm or nibbling at her pockets, probably searching for a non-existent treat. Every time she turned to pet him, though, he would move out of reach. Deciding she could take a hint, she gave up and just ignored him. It seemed to do the trick because he then continued to follow her around. She worried that when she started the four-wheeler he would spook, but he seemed to take it in stride, like everything else. "You're kind of a weird guy, aren't you?" Soon her chores were done. As she wiped the sweat and hair from her brow, she glanced down at her Apple Watch again. Finally, a text from Laura. She clicked on it and was surprised at the message. "Can't come today after all. Please keep him there overnight. I'll fill you in later. Sorry." Weird. She looked at Fortune, who was using his mouth on the handles of the ATV and trying to either eat it or drive it. "You're weird too. I wonder what that is all about. But it looks like you're having a sleepover tonight." She finished her tasks and then decided she'd have to see about a halter and lead when she went into town, just in case she needed to take him over to Gabe's, whose property was already prepared for horses. So far, Joe hadn't seemed to mind, but better safe than sorry. She exited the paddock, called for Cookie, who was ecstatic to go for a car ride, and hopped in her aunt's truck for the 30-minute drive to town.